To those who are just now joining us, welcome and thank you for coming to take part in this day of reflection on the thought of Joseph Ratzinger. This panel discussion will last for a little bit over an hour. We will first hear from each of our panelists, and then I will open things up for Q&A. So be ready to grill our presenters here. The title of this panel is called Liturgy and the Universality of the Christian Solution. Our first presenter, Father Jonathan Torres, received his Bachelor of Arts in English Literature from Belmont Abbey College in 2013. In 2016, he received a Bachelor's in Philosophy from the Pontifical College Josephinum and a Master's in Divinity, also from the Josephinum, in May 2020. He was ordained to the priesthood for the Diocese of Charlotte in July 2020 and currently serves as parochial vicar at St. Matthew's Parish in Charlotte, as well as chaplain for Charlotte Catholic High School. Father Torres' poetry has been published by Z Publishing House in the Anthology of North Carolina's Best Emerging Poets 2019. Father Torres is also part of the podcast Basically Related, where he, along with his brother and brother-in-law, discuss topics ranging from philosophy and theology to movies and politics. He also happens to be my brother, but whether that harms or strengthens his credentials is yet to be determined. The title of Father Torres' presentation is The Avenue of Communication Between Believer and Unbeliever. Please join me in welcoming Father Torres.
Thank you, Elisa, for that beautiful introduction. And just to be assured, I'm not here strictly under familial obligations. I come here by my own free will as well. So, ever since the Enlightenment began in the 17th century, the question, what does Christianity have to offer mankind, has become increasingly difficult to answer. Nietzsche's popular quote that God is dead seems to ring truer now more than ever. And while we may easily claim that many of our modern values, such as freedom, equality, and care for the poor, were born out of a Christian worldview, the relevance of a living and breathing Christianity that is tethered to a belief in Jesus Christ seems to be, to put it lightly, antiquated. In an effort to preserve Christianity in the wake of modernity, some have proposed that faith ought to be severed entirely from reason, and that one's own set of beliefs should not interfere in the field of natural science, since religion ought to be privatized and treated as something that cannot contribute to advancements in society. Christian proponents of this idea hoped that this would allow religion to remain relevant in a modern world. Now, one of the many detrimental effects that this mindset has given rise to is a sense of alienation that Christians may feel when engaged in philosophical and theological discussions with unbelievers. On the face of it, there is no common ground which believer and unbeliever can stand on in order to have a fruitful conversation. If faith ought to be divorced from reason, then there is no effective way to discuss the nature of belief with an unbeliever, since discussion is predicated upon reason. This is precisely what Ratzinger points out in his first chapter of his book, Introduction to Christianity. He recognizes the, quote, oppressive reality in which theology and theological discussion are imprisoned today, and their frustrating inability to break through accepted patterns of thought and speech and make people recognize the subject matter of theology as a serious aspect of human life, unquote. So then what is Ratzinger's solution? In an effort to share common ground with the unbeliever, how does the believer attempt to break out of the prison he finds himself in when attempting to discuss theological matters? What Ratzinger suggests is that in order for the believer to find common ground with the unbeliever, there has to be a recognition of the human condition. This, I believe, is one of Ratzinger's goals with his book, Introduction to Christianity, namely to find common ground with everyone outside of Christianity. Now more than ever, his analysis here is particularly relevant. Most people today are no longer moved by a top-down, rote memorization approach to the faith, but can perhaps be moved by a bottom-up, existential, and subjective approach. And so what is it for Ratzinger about the human condition that could create common ground for the believer and non-believer? Simply put, the inevitability of death. That frightening feeling we all have that, in the end, nothing matters. It is the annihilation of all things through death that more than anything is both known and feared by man. In finding this particular common ground with the unbeliever, Ratzinger accomplishes a number of things. First, he rejects the notion that faith ought to be divorced from reason. While they are distinct, they are not at war with each other. Divorcing faith from reason in a Kantian manner has led to a slippery slope that has had disastrous effects on Christianity in the world today. One only needs to observe our culture to see how religion, and Christianity in particular, has been characterized as intellectually lacking, as if it's a worldview for the simple-minded. If both the believer and unbeliever can agree that there exists a paradox about death, namely that all men must die, and yet all men naturally seek life, then perhaps the unbeliever can, at the very least, understand the potential reason for belief. The second thing Ratzinger accomplishes by identifying the common ground that is death is that he displays his ability to sympathize with his opponent's position. Rather than offering pious platitudes and straw-manning the unbeliever's plight, Ratzinger steelmans his opponent's position, sophisticatedly explaining the intricacies of the problem. I'm reminded here how Thomas Aquinas sets up his arguments in the Summa. And while Ratzinger doesn't write in the same systematic way that Aquinas does, there exists in both an honest reflection of the opposing arguments that only serves to make their arguments all the stronger. And the third thing Ratzinger accomplishes by identifying death as a common ground is that he removes the believer from an unintentionally established pedestal. He states, quote, "If the Christian wants to make an honest effort to give an account for his faith, he has to understand that his own situation is by no means so different from that of others, as he might have thought at the start. He will become aware that on both sides, the same forces are at work, albeit in different ways." Unquote. Now, to bolster this claim, Ratzinger retells the shocking story of St. Therese of Lisieux's own personal doubts amidst her faith. As Ratzinger points out, on the face of it, this lovable and simple nun grew up in an atmosphere of complete religious security. She was cocooned in her faith. And yet, towards the end of her life, she admitted, to the horror of her sisters, that she was, quote, "assailed by the worst temptations of atheism." Her sense of belief seems to have vanished when she, as Ratzinger puts it, caught a glimpse of the lurking abyss that threatened to end all things. Ratzinger writes, quote, "In a situation like this, what's in question is not the sort of thing that one perhaps quarrels about otherwise, the dogma of the Assumption, or the proper use of confession. All this becomes absolutely secondary. What is at stake here is the whole structure. It is a question of all or nothing." Now, it may seem that the temptation to doubt the whole structure of Christianity may lend credence to the unbeliever's worldview. Yet to think this way is to ignore the struggle of the unbeliever. To give into the temptation of doubt does not provide an impenetrable shield against the human condition. Ratzinger puts it well, saying, "Just as the believer is choked by the salt water of doubt constantly washed into his mouth by the ocean of uncertainty, so the unbeliever is troubled by doubts about his unbelief, about the real totality of the world he has made up in his mind to explain as a self-contained whole. He can never be absolutely certain of the autonomy of what he has seen and interpreted as a whole. He remains threatened by the question of whether belief is not, after all, the reality it claims to be. And now listen, just as the believer knows himself to be constantly threatened by unbelief, which he must experience as a continual temptation, so for the unbeliever, faith remains a temptation and a threat to his apparently permanently closed world. In short, there is no escape from the dilemma of being a man. Anyone who makes up his mind to evade the uncertainty of belief will have to experience the uncertainty of unbelief. I'm reminded here of Sheldon Van Auken's autobiography, A Severe Mercy, in which he recalls his conversion to Christianity. Van Auken states that while he was intellectually convinced of the Christian worldview for some time, he couldn't bring himself to make the leap of faith and fully commit himself to Christ, because he knew that for the rest of his life he would ask the question, what if all of this is not true? However, on the night he converted, he realized that if he were to turn away from the precipice before him and choose not to make that leap of faith, he would immediately come upon another precipice. If he chose to reject a life of faith, he would also spend the rest of his life asking, what if it's all true? Van Auken understood that he, like any man who would take this dilemma seriously, was destined to be, as Flannery O'Connor put it, Christ-haunted. Ratzinger echoes Van Auken's sentiments nearly verbatim, writing, quote, "No one can lay God and his kingdom on a table before another man. Even the believer cannot do it for himself. But however strongly unbelief may feel justified, it cannot forget the eerie feeling induced by the words, yet perhaps it is all true. Yet perhaps it is all true." Thus the believer and the unbeliever are destined to share, each in his own way, doubt and belief. In recognizing the shared experience of being human and the universal knowledge that all things will be annihilated by death, both believer and unbeliever can stand on common ground and begin a dialogue towards truth. Ratzinger sums it up well. Perhaps in precisely this way, doubt, which saves both sides from being shut up in their own worlds, could become the avenue of communication. It prevents both from enjoying self-satisfaction. It opens up the believer to the doubter and the doubter to the believer. For one, it is his share in the fate of the unbeliever. For the other, the form in which belief remains, nevertheless, a challenge to him. And before I close, I wanted to mention how providential it is that we are holding this conference during the octave of Easter, this most sacred time of the year in which we celebrate the core of our Christian faith. Christ has risen from the dead. This truth does not trivialize death, nor counsel an escape from death. Rather, we are emboldened to pass through it, for only through the cross do we find everlasting life. This is what Christian belief consists of, and for Ratzinger, it is the crux of Christ's mission, namely that God has ventured out into the realm of death in order to save the world. By that model, we have learned that man only comes to himself by moving away from himself. Rather than grasping at reality, we come to our fulfillment by accepting reality, even if reality is tainted by suffering and death, even if reality looks like the cross. In my opening remarks, I claimed that the question, what does Christianity have to offer mankind, is becoming increasingly difficult to answer. In recognizing the shared experience of death and the doubt that death often brings, the glimmer of the Christian promise can perhaps be seen more clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Torres. We will now be hearing from Dr. Daniel Garland, who holds a doctorate in systematic theology with a minor in biblical theology from Ave Maria University, where he wrote his dissertation on eternal life in the Gospel of John. He has taught theology at Ave Maria University, Christendom College Graduate School of Theology, Catholic Distance University, and for various permanent diaconate programs across the United States. Dr. Garland's articles have appeared in Homiletic and Pastoral Review, Maynooth Theological Journal, Hathrop Journal Angelicum, and Nova et Vetera. He is also the first English translator of St. Jerome's commentary on the prophet Haggai, which is published with IVP's academic Ancient Christian Text series. Dr. Garland is currently the Director of Religious Education for Schools for the Diocese of Charlotte in North Carolina. The title of his presentation is Worship as the Soul of the Covenant, the Liturgical Theology of Joseph Ratzinger.
Thank you. When the project of publishing the collected works of Joseph Ratzinger began, Ratzinger was adamant that his writings on the liturgy had to be at the forefront. For him, the liturgy had been the central reality of his life since his childhood, and it was also to become the center of his theological efforts. In his liturgical theology, Joseph Ratzinger was guided by the question, what is the right response to God? In light of this question, Ratzinger, in both his The Spirit of the Liturgy and in his foreword to his inaugural volume of his collected works, draws our attention to the etymology of the word orthodoxy. He notes that in Greek, doxa means glory. Thus, orthodoxy, Ratzinger points out, is not about having the right idea about God, but about the right way of glorifying him, of responding to him. Christian faith, then, offers, quote, a great gift to the world. We know what right worship is. We know how we should truly glorify God, end quote. In his classic work of liturgical theology, The Spirit of the Liturgy, in seeking to describe the essence of liturgy, Ratzinger began with a discussion of the theory of play, in which the liturgy, quote, would be a kind of anticipation, a rehearsal, a prelude for the life to come, for eternal life, end quote. Yet he rejects this theory of play for the liturgy because it lacks something essential, a determinate reference to God, quote, without whom the life to come would only be a wasteland. Rather than a theory of play as an analogy of the liturgy, Ratzinger begins where all of his theology begins, with the sacred page, the study of which Vatican II's Dei Verbum famously says should be, as it were, the soul of sacred theology. The central text that Ratzinger starts with in order to understand the essence of liturgy is the book of Exodus. He points out that the goal of Exodus is to show the proper manner in which Israel is to worship God. It is here that he highlights a fundamental truth of worship, namely that the true manner of worshiping God must come from a revelation of God himself. Man is a homo liturgicus, that is, by the natural virtue of religion, his very nature is ordered towards worship. Worship, Ratzinger states, lays hold in advance of a more perfect life, and in so doing gives our present life its proper measure. A life without such anticipation, a life no longer opened up to heaven, would be empty, a leaden life. That is why there are in reality no societies altogether lacking in cult. Even the decidedly atheistic, materialistic systems create their own forms of cult, though, of course, they can only be an illusion and strive in vain by bombastic trumpeting to conceal their nothingness, end quote. If man does not order his being toward God as his true end, the result will always be idolatry, a perverted form of worship which, rather than leading to freedom and the fulfillment of man's desires, results in the grossest form of slavery and a distortion of man's nature. Thus, Ratzinger insists, quote, man himself cannot simply make worship. If God does not reveal himself, man is clutching empty space. Moses says to Pharaoh, we do not know with what we must serve the Lord. These words display a fundamental law of all liturgy. When God does not reveal himself, man can, of course, from the sense of God within him, build altars to the unknown God, as St. Paul says on the Areopagus. He can reach out toward God in his thinking and try to feel his way toward him. But real liturgy implies that God responds and reveals how we can worship him. In any form, liturgy includes some kind of institution. It cannot spring from imagination, our own creativity. Then it would remain just a cry in the dark or mere self-affirmation. Liturgy implies a real relationship with another who reveals himself to us and gives our existence a new direction, end quote. How then are we to know the way in which God wants us to worship him? Again, Ratzinger directs us back to Scripture, this time to Genesis and the creation of the world. Here he notes that creation moves toward the Sabbath, the sanctified day wherein man is to enter into the rest of God. Ratzinger draws our attention to the parallels between Moses' construction of the tabernacle, a movable temple, at the end of Exodus, which is punctuated by sevenfold repetitions, and the creation of the world in 7 days. The world is meant to be seen as a cosmic temple, where Adam, as the proto-priest, is called to worship God on the Sabbath. This Sabbath worship that Adam is called to is not an end in itself, but rather is ordered toward union with God. In sabbatical liturgy, Adam is able to realize the fullness of his filial status in relation to God, thereby having access to eternal life. The liturgy that leads to union with God is the expression of the covenant that God makes with Adam. Joseph Ratzinger has stated that God created the world for the purpose of entering into a covenant relation with his rational creatures, and the Sabbath is a sign of this. Quote, by culminating in the sign of the covenant, the Sabbath, the creation account clearly shows that creation and covenant belong together from the start, that the Creator and the Redeemer can only be one and the same God. It shows that the world is not a neutral receptacle where human beings then accidentally become involved, but that right from the start, creation came to be so that there would be a place for the covenant, end quote. It is important to note, he says, the relational aspect of the covenant. The covenant involves, quote, God's gift to himself, to man, but also man's response to God. Man's response to God, who is good to him, is love, and loving God means worshiping him. If creation is meant to be a space for the covenant, the place where God and man meet one another, then it must be thought of as a space for worship, end quote. Elsewhere, Ratzinger connects the covenant with liturgy. He says creation looks toward the covenant, but the covenant completes creation and does not simply exist along with it. Now, if worship, rightly understood, is the soul of the covenant, then it not only saves mankind, but it is also meant to draw the whole of reality into communion with God, end quote. It is through the liturgy that Adam and subsequent humanity is to obtain and persevere in life, since the liturgy is the privileged place of man's communion with God. This definitive communion with God is the end goal to which the liturgy leads. Through the liturgy, Adam is to have a foretaste of the definitive end for which he is made. In the words of Ratzinger, the goal of worship and the goal of creation as a whole are one and the same, divinization, end quote. The doctrine of divinization, or theosis, describes the process whereby man becomes a partaker of the divine nature, according to 2 Peter 1:4. Through theosis, man participates in divinity and reaches union with God. It is important to note that theosis is through a participation in and not a becoming of the divine nature. Theosis does not lead to pantheism. Instead, man is deified while remaining man, as grace does not destroy nature. Not only does worship divinize man, but creation also participates in this in some way, as we will see later. Let us now turn to the heart of worship, which Ratzinger sees as connected to theosis, namely sacrifice. First, a correction must be made to the common understanding that the essence of sacrifice is destruction. Ratzinger asks, what pleasure is God supposed to take in destruction? Is anything really surrendered to God through destruction? Instead, a true surrender to God involves a union with, or quote, belonging to God that has nothing to do with destruction or non-being. It is rather a way of being, end quote. This way of being, Ratzinger says, is the surrender of all things to God. A problem arises, however, with man's fall. Precisely because Adam did not surrender all things to God, he fell from grace. and was in need of making atonement. Ratzinger pinpoints the post-lapsarian dilemma. How is man supposed to make valid atonement to God? Man should offer his whole self as sacrifice, but due to man's fallen nature, this is wholly inadequate. Instead, Ratzinger notes that all the world's religions, including Israel's, seeks to offer a representation. He asks, but how can sacrificial animals or the fruits of harvest represent man, make expiation for him? This is not representation, but replacement, and worship with replacements turns out to be replacement for worship, end quote. What Ratzinger shows is that the solution is found in the movement from and continuity between the Old and the New Covenants. In the Old Covenant, God institutes a representative cult, highlighted in the books of Genesis and Exodus with the Akedah and the Passover. In the Akedah, that is the binding of Isaac, a ram stands in place of the heir of the promise to Abraham. In the Passover, an unblemished lamb is sacrificed in the place of Israel's firstborn sons. These representative sacrifices and all the others of Israel's history are not ends in themselves. Neither was the temple, the place where Israel's sacrifices were performed. This too pointed beyond itself. What these representative sacrifices pointed to is the reality that is Jesus Christ. Here, the incarnation becomes decisive. God becomes man and tabernacles amongst us, as John tells us in John 1:14. Here is the true temple. Ratzinger says, quote, the living body of Jesus Christ, which will now stand in the sight of God and be the place of all worship. Into this body he incorporates men. It is the tabernacle that no human hands have made, the place of true worship of God, which casts out the shadow and replaces it with the reality, end quote. In the incarnation, human nature is also able to once again make an offering acceptable to God, since it is hypostatically united to God himself. Ratzinger notes that Christ's self-giving is meant to become ours. We are to, quote, become contemporary with the Pasch of Christ and assimilated unto God, end quote. We are, in other words, to enter into theosis through the cross of Christ. Thus, the new covenant is definitive for restoring union between God and man. Ratzinger declares, quote, worship through types and shadows, worship with replacements, ends at the very moment when the real worship takes place. The self-offering of the Son, who has become man and lamb, the firstborn who gathers up into himself all worship of God, takes it from the types and shadows into the reality of man's union with the living God, end quote. The liturgy of Jesus Christ's offering of himself to the Father brings creation to completion, but at the same time, it also inaugurates a new creation. Thus, all true liturgy has Christ at its center. The liturgy of the Old Covenant points forward to Christ, and the liturgy of the New Covenant is a participation in the cross of Christ. It is here where Ratzinger will draw out the implications for liturgy as a cosmic and eschatological reality. The day of Christ's resurrection is described in John's Gospel as the first day. The resurrection is the beginning of the first day of the new creation, which takes up the old creation and offers it the hope of redemption. Ratzinger points us to St. Paul's words in Romans 8, for the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. Creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning with labor pains together until now, and not only creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies, end quote. Just as creation took part in man's fall, so also shall creation be redeemed with man. Ratzinger says the cosmos is praying with us. Ratzinger points out that this cosmic dimension of redemption is essential to Christian liturgy. Quote, the theme of creation is embedded in Christian prayer. It loses its grandeur when it forgets this connection, end quote. Ratzinger also reminds us that in Psalm 19, the sun, which comes forth like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, is interpreted in light of Christ. He says, the fact that we find Christ in the symbol of the rising sun is the indication of a Christology defined eschatologically. Praying toward the east means going to meet the coming Christ. The liturgy, turned toward the east, affects entry, so to speak, into the procession of history toward the future, the new heaven and the new earth which we encounter in Christ, end quote. This eastward orientation gives us our cosmically eschatological liturgy. All of creation, history, and time is taken up in the liturgy, which directs us to the risen Christ, who has passed through death and thereby has destroyed death. Ratzinger notes that, quote, in the liturgy, the curtain between heaven and earth is torn open, and we are taken up into a liturgy that spans the whole cosmos, end quote. What this means is that heaven doesn't come down in Christian liturgy. Rather, we go up to the heavenly liturgy. We participate in the first day of the resurrection and so have a foretaste of the heavenly liturgy that has no end. This is the true worship that Jesus speaks of in John 4, worship of the Father in spirit and truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garland. I'm realizing now that there's a delightful irony in that our resident cleric is speaking, spoke of the human condition, and our laymen are speaking of liturgy. So, well-rounded panel. And to finish us off here, we have Gregory DiPippo, our final presenter. DiPippo is a native of Providence, Rhode Island. DiPippo has studied Latin, Greek, and several other languages, as well as classics at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, and patristics at the Augustinian Patristic Institute in Rome. He has been a regular contributor to the New Liturgical Movement website since 2009 and the editor since 2013. His writings cover a very wide variety of topics, but his first specialty was the study of the reforms of the Roman liturgy before the Second Vatican Council, on which he has written several series of articles. He is currently also teaching Latin for Belmont Abbey College and for Veterum Sapientia Institute. His presentation is entitled Summorum Pontificum, the fruit of Cardinal Ratzinger's liturgical thought.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. This presentation, I feel like the undergraduate who shows up for his comps and is told by the board, just give us your summary in 10 minutes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, because, as you know, liturgy and the question of the liturgy permeates the enormous volume of Pope Benedict's writings spanning, well over 70 years. Speaking about the sort of the culmination of this, again, as you know, on July 7th of 2007, he issued the motu proprio, Summorum Pontificum, which officially established the almost completely free use of the older missal, the missal which we all improperly but very usefully call Tridentine. He himself actually wrote about this, that this is a very bad term, but it's become the standard term, unfortunately. And the other liturgical books that go along with it. After this became active after a 9-week vacatio legis, where people are given time to prepare for the implementation of the new law. So the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross was when it became legally active. As if you listen to Dr. Garland's talk, then obviously a significant choice of date for ecumenical reasons, since it's one of the most important feasts with the Eastern Church. What I'm going to begin with are the sort of enormous material to work with. I mean, I could just read a series of quotes from him, and if I got to the end, you say, oh, that's why he issued the motu proprio. But I'm going to begin with something which is perhaps a little, shouldn't be whether legalization of permission to say these primarily as a concession to groups like the Society of St. Pius X and others that use the regardless of the specific circumstances. Controversial because it has been asserted more than once, even at fairly high levels of the ecclesiastical hierarchy that this was Pope Benedict's motivation for issuing proprio. Ewald, in the interview, which was published under the title Last Testament, asked him directly about this. So, and of course, ressourcement, go back to the sources. So if you want to know why a guy did a thing, ask him. And Ewald asked him this question directly, whether the reauthorization of the Tridentine Mass was primarily a concession to the Society of St. Pius X. To this, Pope Benedict responded, and these are the words of a German professor, a man who chooses his words very carefully. So he said, "That is just absolutely false. It was important for me that the Church be one with herself inwardly, with her own past, that what was previously holy to her not be somehow wrong now. The rite must develop. In that sense, reform is appropriate, but the continuity must not be ruptured." And as we heard from Professor Thomas, this is, of course, a very significant theme of all of his writings, that continuity is very, very important in the life of the Church. So now he does go on, of course, to say that the Society of St. Pius X is based on the fact that people felt that the Church was renouncing itself. And again, people felt that, again, carefully chosen words. That must not be, but as I said, my intentions were not of a tactical nature, they were about the substance of the matter itself. So in other words, permission to use the old missal side by side with the new was a way of asserting that the continued existence of the traditional rite is, in his view, something necessary to the substance of the liturgical problem in the Church today and necessary to the resolution of the liturgical problem in the Church today. So now I find myself constrained to make another statement, which will perhaps be seen as rather controversial, because the simple fact of the matter is that the continuity was in fact ruptured, quite violently, in fact. There's no language like French for talking about this. And there's a French Dominican who referred to this as an éclatement liturgique sauvage, a savage liturgical rupture. So from a man who does not himself celebrate the rite of his order, the Dominican rite. But it is simply a fact that the post-conciliar liturgical form went far, far beyond the letter of the Second Vatican Council's document on liturgical reform, Sacrosanctum Concilium, and introduced a great many changes that it did not ask for or envision. And this is a fact which is perhaps far less well known and understood than it should be, in my view. Now, I speak to you here as a somewhat professional liturgy geek, but one who also studied the classics. And I had very, very good teachers all the way along. I was incredibly blessed in that. So one of the things I learned is that the first rule of rhetoric is know your audience. So I'm not going to bore you with the details. If you want them, I have them in abundance. But this is Joseph Ratzinger's description of the problem. This is a letter which he wrote in 1976 to a German, a very famous German canonist, Austrian canonist, Wolfgang Waldstein. He wrote about this, quote, "The problem of the new missal lies in its abandonment of an historical process that was always continual before and after St. Pius V, and in the creation of a completely new book, although it was compiled of old material, the publication of which was accompanied by a prohibition of all that came before it, which besides is unheard of in the history of both law and liturgy." And this is fundamentally true. There have been many ways in which the liturgy has evolved over time. There are churches which have historically, the historical Patriarchate of Jerusalem, for example, basically abandoned its own liturgy in favor of the Rite of Byzantium. But there has never been a case in which you had sort of legal prohibitions issued saying you can't use the old books anymore in the same way as the prohibitions that were issued in the late 1960s. And then he goes on to say, remember, as a man who chooses his words very carefully and who was a peritus at Vatican II, one of the experts whose job it was to consult for the cardinals, I can say with certainty, based on my knowledge of the conciliar debates and my repeated reading of the speeches made by the Council Fathers, some of which I have written myself, of course, you know that, right? So, that this does not correspond to the intentions of the Second Vatican Council. So, now, by the way, we don't actually just have to take his word for it. And going back to your question, sir, the gentleman, I think it's fair to at least guess that there would be a number of German bishops, both his contemporaries at the council and recent, who would simply deny any of this. But like I said, we don't have to take his word for it. Cardinal Ferdinando Antonelli, who was part of the commission that did the liturgical reform and very much in favor of the concept of liturgical reform, wrote this about the committee that produced the liturgical reform, which is called the Concilium ad exequendam, the committee for implementing Sacrosanctum Concilium. And he wrote, "The concilium is merely an assembly of people, many of them incompetent, and others of them well advanced on the road to novelty." When in Italian, the word in Italian is incapace. This is a culturally loaded word. This is how an Italian politely says complete morons. The discussions are extremely hurried. Discussions are based on impressions. The voting is chaotic. The direction is weak. That which is sad, however, is a fundamental datum, a mutual attitude, a pre-established position. Namely, many of those who have influenced the reform have no love and no veneration of that which has been handed down to us. This ties in with what Cardinal Ratzinger said about liturgy is not supposed to come out of our own creativity. As Dr. Garland pointed out, they begin by despising everything that is actually there. This negative mentality is unjust and pernicious, and unfortunately, Paul VI tends a little to this side. They have all the best intentions, but with this mentality, they have only been able to demolish and not to restore. So, and another witness on behalf of then Father Ratzinger, a Jesuit named Father Joseph Gelino, who's one of the most influential members of this concilium, and highly praised by the sort of the director of the concilium. This is very famous, or depending on who you talk to, infamous archbishop named Annibale Bonini, and he was highly praised by Bonini. Father Gelino says this in a book called Demande la Liturgie: "Let those who, like myself, have known and sung," a Jesuit who sang, really, whatever, a Latin Gregorian High Mass, remember it if they can. Let them compare it with the Mass that we have now. Not only the words, the melodies, some of the gestures are different. To tell the truth, it is a different liturgy of the Mass. This needs to be said without ambiguity. The Roman Rite, as we knew it, no longer exists. It has been destroyed. Some walls of the former edifice have fallen while others have changed their appearance, to the extent that it appears today either as a ruin or the partial substructure of a different building. This is the words of one of the builders. We must not weep over the ruins or dream of an historical reconstruction. Now, I would say that Pope Benedict was fully aware of two problems that come from this. One is simply, as I said before, this is just unprecedented in the Church's history, this radical degree of discontinuity. The history of Catholic liturgy has always been marked by continuity and slow transitions. Transitions, but slow transitions nonetheless. But that this being the case, that the current status of the post-conciliar reform as the Church's normative, the Latin Church's normative liturgy, carries with it the understanding that it just isn't that much of a problem to go against the words of an ecumenical council. So, and so I would therefore propose to understand Pope Benedict's liberalization of the use of the Roman Rite as something analogous to what he did in writing the Jesus of Nazareth trilogy. One of the other constitutions of the Council Dei Verbum on the Bible explicitly states that the Gospels are accurate accounts of the life of Christ, which, before the so-called Enlightenment, would not have been considered a controversial statement among Christians. and that it does so, but not only this, Dei Verbum does so that in terms that are very deliberately chosen to reflect exactly the concept of continuity. It says, quote, "The Church has always and everywhere held and continues to hold that the four Gospels are of apostolic origin. For what the apostles preached in fulfillment of the commission of Christ, afterwards they themselves, and apostolic men under the inspiration of the divine Spirit, handed on to us in writing the foundation of faith, namely the fourfold gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Holy Mother Church has firmly and with absolute constancy held and continues to hold that the four gospels just named are accurate records of what Jesus Christ did and taught for our eternal salvation until he was taken up into heaven. The reality is that this has been de facto denied. Not so long ago, the Superior General of a fairly notable religious order said, well, we can't really know what Jesus Christ did and said because they didn't have tape recorders. And so Pope Benedict wrote a trilogy of books asserting the historicity of the Gospels in response to this de facto attack on Dei Verbum. And so likewise in the history of the Church's liturgy, when he writes in the letter explaining why he issued Summorum Pontificum, what earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too. And it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. He might just as well have phrased this as follows: Holy Mother Church has firmly and with absolute constancy held and continues to hold that the historical rite of the Roman Church is a good and beneficial thing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. Okay, we have about a little over 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to just kind of get us started here. One theme that I kind of traced throughout your presentations was this relational aspect of God and man. In some ways, this is as old as the Trinity in terms of the Church's recognition of this reality. But many do remark upon this feature in Ratzinger's work, that he stresses this relational aspect. On the one hand, it seems that, Gregory, as you pointed out, there's many problems might be traced back to maybe getting this relational aspect wrong in the liturgy. You think of the ways in which active participation that's stressed in Vatican II is misunderstood. What does it mean for the Church to engage modern man without reducing its truth, its quality? Dr. Garland, you mentioned, right, that heaven doesn't come down to us. We go up, right? So what does it mean for the Church to meet modern man if it is just this ascent, right, of the individual, right, to the Church? And then finally, Father Torres, kind of the same question here, right? Especially between believer and unbeliever, between Church and unbeliever. Why this relational aspect of God in our time? Why does he stress this particular aspect in our time? Why is it important for modern man maybe to be met in the particularity of his doubt? So to that, maybe we'll go in order of presentations or however you want to do it. But please feel free to respond.
Yeah, I think, and this kind of touches on Dr. King's point earlier about the tension between the collective and the individual. And this is a question as old as Socrates when he talks about the one and the many. Ultimately, the way Ratzinger would answer, and he answers this in his Introduction to Christianity, is that it's within the Trinity that tension is reconciled. I think there's of course there's an aspect of mystery there that the two are for lack of a better term, fundamentally at odds with the individual and the collective. But it's in Christ that we see a glimmer or a glimpse of reconciliation between the one and the many. And it's that relational aspect of that subjectivity and that existentialism that we can actually come to a sort of objective truth and see that we share this human condition with everybody. I think, as I mentioned in my talk, that it's becoming more prevalent now than ever to work towards truth in this bottom-up approach, in this more subjective, Augustinian, as it were, approach to truth. I think in the past, the church could be very much content with giving objective answers, more of a top-down, like I mentioned, rote memorization approach to the faith. But now, when the emphasis in our culture is so, it's so individually driven, there's a sense of like, what does my condition have to do with the world around me and the people around me? And if a person is asking those questions honestly, and if he's observant, I feel like there can be an easy access to, again, the objective. When you notice, like, well, okay, you suffer, and I suffer. What is this about our objective condition that is telling me about my subjective experience? I hope that's a little clear there. So, yeah, I don't know if you guys had any thoughts?
Sure. I think with regard to modern man is closed in on himself, right? And so, but as Ratzinger points out, man is by nature a being that worships, right? So we want to go beyond ourselves. We want to have that encounter with the other, something greater than ourselves. And he points out even the atheistic communities, they claim to be free of religion, but the state becomes their religion, right? They're worshiping something, right? So this is part of nature. When the liturgy is done in such a way that raises man up, right? So that we go up to heaven, that this is evident in the liturgy that we're celebrating. In my own tradition, the Byzantine liturgy, Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, this is evident, right? The whole structure of the liturgy is to get man out of himself, to encounter the one with whom he has this relationship with. When modern man sees that, I think that it's better able to recognize that man isn't the measure of reality, right? That there is something greater out there, that we must strive for. So this is why liturgy is the center of what Ratzinger's whole project is, right? It's why he wanted this to be at the forefront of his thought, because it's important. It's the essential thing, our relationship to our Creator, right, to the Triune God.
I would just say that also has to be expanded to understanding of our relationship to not just those among those with whom we live, but with those with whom the church has lived through all of its history. So that, when we go to the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, we know that we're saying prayers, the same prayers in the same fashion that they were said by, minimally 6th century, possibly earlier. And that sense of continuity is something that transcends not just space, but also time, that we know that our relationship is also to those who have preceded us in the faith. That is an indispensable part of what it means to be a Christian.
Excellent. I'll open things up. Bradley?
I was thinking about the sacramental rite, particularly the unction, when you commend the soul, priest commends the soul to go forth to crush the soul. You can interpret it as almost the priest telling the soul, like, go, God, it is time for you to go. And then the next time the priest would have seen that person would have been when he receives the body or the funeral mass. And so I guess the question stems off Ratzinger's point of death being either too taboo or too much of a show. How does the sacramental life correct that error in the modern world? And how ought we kind of view the sacramental rite of death and just kind of the death event as
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, in Ratzinger's eschatology in his book, he really pinpoints the gravity of death. And he does mention how in our culture there seems to be the way that we refer to death in order to avoid it, we refer to it very euphemistically. We say, oh, he passed away, as if like, it's a simple moving on, like a stepping through the door. And, while there's, nothing intrinsically wrong with that way of thinking, I think that language doesn't take death seriously enough. And so, I think ultimately what Ratzinger would say is that death is unnatural. It's unnatural to man. All men must die, but for every man is an accident, right? And it kind of calls the world into question. I'm quoting Simone de Beauvoir here. Not the most popular thinker, I'm sure, at the Abbey, but at the same time, there's something true to that. And I think the sacramental life is, at its core, as Dr. Garland and we heard, is eschatological. It's looking towards the end. And so there is great hope in saying, yes, we can face the weight of death seriously. We can stare death in the face and still pass through it. Christianity does not take death lightly. This is why we hang up not a cross, a crucifix in the middle of our churches. We look death in the face. And then we're still able to worship in light of that, right? Not only in light of that, but that's the core of Christian worship, is the cross, as Dr. Garland mentioned. And so the sacraments, I think, they fortify us to, yes, stare death in the face, take it with serious gravitas, but then we're emboldened to know that it's through death and through the cross that we come to have life. And the sacraments, I think, in being eschatological, show us that. So,
Yeah, and you got to remember that it's through death that Christ destroys death, right? That death has no sting now, right? Because, and this is the great Christian hope. This is what gives us the where all things are subjected in hope, spe salvi, right? As St. Paul says. It's because of Christ's death that we as Christians no longer need to fear death, right? It's been conquered. And our destination, our end is with Christ, who is no longer dead but is living eternally, right? And so the sacraments give us a participation in that, so that the very nature of the sacraments is to give us that contact with life itself, who is Jesus Christ.
My comment on this will be a long dive into a lot of weeds. So come out, talk to me afterwards if you want. Maybe somebody else could ask a question instead of listening to me talk about the weeds. Yes. Yes, there is. It's not just the Mass, it's everything. Here's the simplest example, because it was the very first one, 1968, where they revised the reform. They revised the first thing that was actually completely rebuilt ex nihilo was the rite of episcopal ordination. And the committee decided that the thing which we had been using in the Roman Rite for episcopal ordinations from as far back as we have sources, which puts us in the middle of the 6th century, in the so-called Leonine Sacramentary, until 1968, was just too Jewish. So we had to get rid of it and replace it with something which was historically Roman, which is the prayers from Hippolytus. A member of the committee had just published, another German, Bernhard Botte, had just published a critical edition of it, available in all the good bookstores in Rome for only 60,000 lira. And so they said, well, we'll go back to that, because that's the real and original, authentic Roman thing. There's not a single credible scholar today who would defend the authenticity of that work as a work that represents anything having to do with the Roman Rite, including, if you Google John Baldwin Hippolytus, you'll find a paper right away on Google, who admits this, and there is no construction of this man's work that makes him a traditionalist or a conservative. He's a Jesuit liberal at Boston College, but I repeat myself. And I mean, so that this is the oldest possible prayer that we have went into the bin on totally false scholarly pretext, which no one is concerned to defend anymore. So I mean, this is a problem that Ratzinger thought was really very serious. So, I mean, I don't think there's any construction of Ratzinger's work. I mean, this is a book, he used this liturgical book, but I don't think there's any construction of his thought that say that this is not a problem.
Okay, one more question. Yeah, Alex?
Could you elaborate, since I think it's part of the same question. So you mentioned this 1976 letter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but what specifically about it?
So the question is, what is that? So you said that because they're prohibiting things in a way that the church never did, but did they at least leave some things that didn't prohibit that were continuous? And I hope for me, a total break with continuity would be something.
Like erasure and rewriting. No, it's no. Sure. You have to pick it apart from thing by thing. A colleague of mine, Dr. Matthew Hazel, has just done an analysis. 13% of the prayers that are in the Missal of 1962 make it intact into the Missal of 1970. So, but over and over, but let's say that more problematic is the idea that there's not a single historically Roman thing, not in the Missal. There's not a single historically Roman thing that makes it into the new Missal in its historical form. So the implications, I mean, Dr. Thomas was also talking about credibility. It doesn't say a lot for the credibility of the church to then, as Ratzinger said, to then take this thing, which we had always regarded as our most sacred possession, and treat it as a piece of garbage, to be not just, prohibited, but to violently prohibited and cast out of the church people who don't accept this idea. So it's not a total lack of continuity. It is a lack of continuity on a level that does not exist, and there's no other example comparable to it. So does that answer your question?